So welcome to the OpenChain monthly meeting. We're kicking off September. It's a quiet time. Most people are still on vacation or thinking about vacation. Nevertheless, here we are, and we're going to go through some of the key news items and also some of the key action items for the community. Most of the audience, as usual, will be offline. We're in strange time zones in Asia. It just crossed midnight here in Japan. Anyway, the first thing we do in every meeting is show the antitrust policy notice. You can find the full antitrust policy from the Linux Foundation on our website. And if you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. Now, diving right in, our agenda is pretty simple, and this meeting is pretty interactive if you wish it to be. We have some news. We do some work or analysis of where the standards are at. We have a space for any other business, so you can raise topics, and then we close the meeting. Now, on the news front, a lot has been happening. So instead of describing lots of news items, I wanted to give context. With ISO IEC DIS 18974 having a successful ballot, we are now in a situation where the OpenChain project has fundamentally changed. We've completed our transformation from an open source compliance standardization project into an open source management standardization project. What we do hasn't changed, in that our mission remains building trust in the supply chain. And the way we do that is by creating processes. The scope of the processes we cover has increased. And with two ISO standards in play, that has implications for the future. We'll discuss that a little bit in a minute. Now, where are we at with those ISO standards? Well, the newest one, the security standard, is now officially named ISO IEC PRE 18974. What that means is that we're all done with it and it's in the ISO publication queue. When precisely will it be published? I don't know. It depends on when they hit publish. As soon as they do, we'll be describing it as ISO IEC 18974 and promoting it strongly around the world as an ISO standard. Meanwhile, it's still available as a de facto standard, and people are adopting it. Now, talking about the original standard, ISO 5230, that continues to get more and more support and adoption around the world. Some of the notable things that have happened there are companies like Line announcing conformance or Deloitte announcing that they're a certifier. We expect to have 3 more announcements around that standard this week. There's been some pretty cool stuff on the partner side. I mentioned Deloitte, which is great to have them as a certifier, but they're not the only new certifier in town. We've had the National Financial Technology Certification Center in Beijing join our partner program. What that means is more and more banks and other financial technology firms will be OpenChain certified. We've had an education organization called OpenTecher, which does all types of developer certifications in China, become an official partner. And we've worked with a company called Prism Technologies, a tooling vendor based in China. So lots and lots going on there on the partnership side. When it comes to the security standard adoption, I thought it's worth pointing out that in the last couple of weeks, we've had 2 more companies announce that they're using the de facto standard. So that's Canopus and Revenera. And they join companies like BlackBerry and LG and Interneuron. Oh, hi, Mary. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
I'm just going to wrap up the news by pointing out there's tons more work underway. You're going to see our legal work group publishing model provisions, which will help lawyers think through negotiations and contracts in procurement using our standards. Our spec team is working on a new proposal for a contribution spec. More on that in a minute, and I'm sure that's why some of the people are on the call. Hey, Anna, how are you doing? Anna is the person who leads the to-do group and has been doing obviously amazing work around contribution and also bringing the community together. We've been working on cool stuff like Ospology Live. Our telco team is finishing a proposal for a telco SBOM spec. That's kind of a meta spec saying what you need to do when you're shopping around for specs. Now, there could be more and more and more, but what I'm going to do is dive us into the actual work on standards and core material. And then at the end, in any other business, I'm going to point you at a few cool things like upcoming events. Right. In case you need it, for the standards that are published, you will find them in the chat. And if you want to see the future versions of standards we're making, you'll find them in the chat as well. So short version is we actually have an ISO standard for licensing, a forthcoming ISO standard for security, and we've just kicked off a new contribution standard development cycle. When it comes to existing standards like licensing and security, we're building on the past. When it comes to contribution, we're starting from scratch. In all cases, as we edit these things, we will be essentially making a community proposal. That proposal, when we say, oh, the next generation licensing standard is finished, or the first version of the contribution standard is finished, we send the proposal to our steering committee, and they vote on A, is the update to a standard going through as is, with changes or not at all? Or is a new standard like contribution going through with changes or not at all? In other words, the steering committee is the final decision maker in this process. But before we get there, we do a lot of editing in the community, a lot of work and a lot of thinking. Now, we took a break in August because everyone was tired and we needed to go to the beach. In August, we were doing a lot of work on our security and licensing specs. We were mostly focused at the end towards tidying up terms and definitions and SBOM definitions between security and licensing to make sure they aligned. And if you want to see exactly what we did, I have just posted that in the chat. Not all of the links seem to be posting correctly, weirdly enough. The last link didn't get through, I guess. Okay, anyhow, basically the material that we've got on terms and definitions, SBOM definitions are general and they benefit both specs. And now that we're looking at a new spec for contribution, benefits them too. Basically, if we find something that can be the same between our standards, we make it the same. These are a family of sister standards. When it comes to what we're up to next, well, we have a lot to do on licensing and security. We're targeting end of year to have something to go to our steering committee, maybe early December, and say, look, we think this is an update to the ISO standards. Maybe this is something you can improve, in which case it will be updated in 2024. The thing that really came up to us then was something related to quality. We talk about SBOMs in a general sense, and a discussion kicked off. What is a quality SBOM? How do we understand in the supply chain and process management what a quality SBOM is that a company might want to ask for? Now that conversation is just starting, but it is being informed by a lot of prior work done by our telco work group. Remember I mentioned they made a telco SBOM, which essentially covers that. Now it looks like what we might do is very politely borrow or steal a chunk of the telco SBOM and perhaps put it into our licensing and security specs, or perhaps spin it out as a, if you're looking for SBOMs, here's the kind of approaches you can take on analyzing which SBOMs to take, and here's what you might expect in an SBOM that will actually be useful in the context of internal, but also supply chain use. And of course, we don't do things in isolation. We build on the work of others. SPDX Lite was created by the OpenChain Japan work group, but it's part of the SPDX project. And the SPDX Lite proposal is in SPDX 2.2. It's in appendices 7, I believe. And basically, it's a minimal subset, fields identified by companies actively using it today in the supply chain in Japan to help ensure that suppliers, even tiny ones, can get a few key items in SBOMs that will allow the supply chain to be efficient. In other words, what's the minimal quality SBOM? So we sort of left that thread hanging. We said, okay, let's talk about it. We know Telco's done a lot on it, and we know we need to compare and contrast with SPDX Lite. Okay, so that's on the table for that. And the answer is in August, we did nothing. So we're still exactly there. And we do have other next steps for both of those standards as well. We've got a bunch of open issues. And just for the sake of making this chat completely full, I've posted the links to those issues there. Okay, so in general, we have open issues, and we had a conversation about quality SBOM. I'm going to ask our chairs, Chris and Helio, in the context of the licensing and security standards, do you think in the next call or two we should lean into the quality SBOM topic, or do you think we should go back and look at our current open issues?
This is Chris. I
Hey.
think that how are you today?
Alive.
I hear you. Didn't want to come back to work today, 4-day weekend. I think that we should probably take a look at our open issues in the licensing and security realms, but I also think that it's important to start diving into the SBOM quality issue as well.
There's a very common pattern that we are doing since every meeting. We started discussing the open topics, and usually the discussion goes way long, and we end up doing this offline during the past. So maybe you can just reserve just a small part to discussing the issues and goes offline anyway after, and then reserve the last part to discuss the quality of SBOM.
Okay, so in that case, we'll very quickly look at the open issues and then, maybe swing to the quality SBOM. All right. Now, before we do that, what I'd like to do before handing back to you is just let people know what I'm talking about with this contribution spec, which some people might be totally unaware of. What we've done in the last few months is a conversation has opened about making a specification describing business process management regarding contribution. What type of things do you need to think about? And this was opened as a conversation by email, but quickly recorded on GitHub because it became apparent there was a lot of material. And we had a kickoff call in August. Long story short, there seems to be a ton of things we can do to help with corporate process management, business process management around contribution to open source. Things like how to contain risk, how to have a policy in place and contact people in place, and so on. In some ways, it's incredibly boring and business as usual. In other ways, we may be able to provide support to the overall community in our process management high-level way. And once companies see the basic process management, then they can dig further into areas with tons and tons of contribution information like the to-do group, which has wealth of data on that topic. Now, just so you know, and because everyone loves me posting in the chat, here's another 7 or so links into the chat. Basically, we have several issues open already about this. And there's one issue that was open first, initial topics for discussion. And it shows the type of things that we're likely to talk about in the next couple of weeks and months regarding the contribution spec. So approval documents and records, aligning company strategy to contribution, processes to deal with unauthorized contribution, CLAs if you're looking at contributing to a project, application of metrics possibly, and contact points to question or respond if people have process or legal matters they want to bring up. Now, this is just a few initial topics. And actually, if you go to the repo for contributional, you'll notice that there's other stuff. For example, Anna's already posted a ton of material from the To-Do Group project. We've had SAP provide some great links into what they're up to regarding how they manage things like contribution. And we've had other submissions. For instance, Cornelius just opened an issue on the topic. Contribution, in other words, tons of material, lots to look at. And people, if they're not familiar with what we've done, should probably go to the kickoff call. And the kickoff call is important because that sets the tone for how we build every standard. The processes in place, the timelines, the submission of ideas, the submission of challenges and problems, and so on and so forth. Long story short, and we're going to hand back to our chairs so they can do their licensing and security work in a minute. But long story short, it looks like contribution could very well be another standard for the OpenChain project to do. Our goal would be to ensure that business process management would take into account contributing to open source projects and potentially, if you look at our open issues, spinning up open source projects and expecting contributions, and the process management behind that. What are the legal considerations, the policy considerations, the training considerations, the remediation considerations? As usual, we would actually aim to have a short outcome document, something really small, just a few pages long to get companies started, and to redirect people into deep resource areas like To-Do Group when they want to get into the details, see about things like community norms, make friends, get help. Anna, I just wanted to pull you in briefly here, if that's okay. And, if I'm correct, I believe To-Do Group has, not only the mailing lists, you've got frequent calls, you've got, of course, also things like Ospology Live. So I think it would be fair to say that it provides a very strong point where if people adopt one of these items, let's say we build a contribution standard and say, what next? We already have all the infrastructure in place to help them with that question.
Yeah, so from the To-Do side is more focused on OSPOS and open source initiatives. And we develop like best practices, not as standards, as for instance, in OpenChains, we were doing in a more organizational view, but this is focused for those OSPO or leaders in an organization managing open source strategy that wants to establish, for instance, a guide on how to contribute to open source projects, but under the lens of the OSPO. So for that, we do have a lot of references, best practices put together by the community. We are also have a working group involved in open source engagement guide that some of them I know like they're really interested to contribute to this OpenChain contribution specification. So for me, I see like really useful to collaborate together and to the community, bring the community to this specification, because there is, of course, OSPOs, I believe that they will be using this specification, or I would love them to have this specification for them to use, because I believe that it's a profile that I think they're thinking of having this kind of specifications.
Thanks, Anna. And one thing that'd be great, I think it's always been our perspective. It'll be great if we can be in a situation where we have corporate, we've got legal, we've got the procurement teams, and we somehow capture a lot of this mind share of people who mightn't be that familiar with open source, who might immediately put a blocker on it, and maybe have a gentle way to provide an organizational process management that helps reduce the friction, reduce some of the blocks to get companies involved in open source, and equally importantly, to get them doing it right. So this contribution spec looks quite fun. It is a little different to where we've been before. There can be no doubt that our compliance standard and our security standard present the baseline of what people need to do open source. You cannot use open source without compliance management. Otherwise, it's third-party intellectual property unmanaged in your organization. The baseline for getting started is compliance. And in the modern world, you cannot do open source or any software without security. Your baseline here is you have to have an approach to manage security. Otherwise, liability and risk is enormous. So both compliance and security have been on the fundamentals here. We're talking a line item under cost of goods. There's no way you can do open source without compliance and security. Moving into contribution, we're entering an area which is much more about increasing efficiency, increasing return, and also reducing another risk area. You know, a company should know what they're contributing and know why, and have a way to make sure their developers are comfortable too. So it's a slightly less baseline absolutely must be done item, but it's very much a should be done item. And we can probably help, as I said, get a lot of influence in the industry to maybe get more companies contributing, and certainly get to more companies contributing more efficiently and coherently. Anyway, we will come back to contribution, and we will live edit it on these calls and on GitHub moving forward. I have actually created the first version of the contribution spec, but it's not there. It's not really. It's just a placeholder, okay? It's here. And this placeholder is obviously just a fork of the third generation licensing spec. And in the next few days and weeks, I'll be working on that fork to chop out sections which are obviously not relevant and put placeholders in based on our open issues, asking people, do we put XYZ here? For example, approval systems for contribution, addressing CLAs, process to deal with unauthorized contributions. I'll be putting in placeholders there and helping lead the discussion on this. The issues are open on GitHub. Go have a look and go contribute. Anna, your hand is up. Over to you.
Yeah, so I was actually opening an issue to suggest, because I've been like reading a bit the draft of the contribution process specification. One of the things I was missing in the requirements, but I might be wrong because I'm not familiar on how OpenChain builds specifications, but I was missing like the need of having an open source strategy, like the same that there is like a compliance process in place, there should be an open source strategy. And I'm saying that because that is something that at least into the community, a lot of OSPO leaders has been complaining that we didn't have an open source strategy that was aligned with organization's goals. That's why our OSPO failed. And I'm not saying that the OSPO is the only one building this contribution specification or will use this contribution specification, but I believe that maybe having something there that mentions open source strategy might be useful. I'm though sharing it as an issue so we can discuss whether it makes sense to have it here or not.
No, that's really good feedback, and it fits right into where we're going. So for OpenChain generally, we start out by saying have a policy. And this spec, basically the only thing that's done so far is to move section 3.5 of the licensing spec into section 3.1. And that's saying have a policy about contributions. And for us, that will be the baseline of getting a company thinking about it. And then there's the question of what's strategic. How do we tie this into business goals? And a lot of OSPOs, for example, seem to have got really hard hit with cost cutting. As CFOs come down, they tend to put a lot of the open source work under operational expenses, and they cut it because they don't put it under budgets like product development. So tying into business strategy, absolutely. And we have an issue open, so I'd super appreciate if you could tie into it. And it's just a placeholder issue. I'm putting it in the chat. Company strategy as it applies to contribution. This is a placeholder created by Jimmy. And if you could reference that in your issue, it would be super, super useful. And then we'll work on that. I mean, hypothetically, we're looking at a potential straight path from saying, you know, have a policy, and then digging further and saying perhaps that your policy should be tied into business strategy. All right, this is great. Now, time is a bit tight, so I'm going to hand over to our licensing and security chairs, unless there's another pressing issue or contribution. Do one of you want to take the screen share and have a look at your respective things? Have a look at some of the open issues, or do you want me to screen share? Obviously, I'd love if someone else would do it because I'm lazy. It seems guilt fails today. That's fine.
I think it's all the more reason for you to do it if you're lazy.
Thank you, Chris, for schooling me. All right, fine. Okay. All right, licensing first. So we have a bunch of stuff.
Yeah, okay.
Elio finally finished doing whatever he was doing in the corner just to join in and taunt me. Okay. All right, so licensing, we've got a bunch of items to look at. And one, picking randomly here, you know, overarching stuff. We've been looking at some overarching things recently. We looked at terms and definitions. We looked at SBOMs. Maybe we should look at something like program scope. And this is something Marcel from PwC raised. So he was saying that when we mention a program, we should be very clear that it is stated in the definition, and we must define it. In other words, put a boundary around what we mean by open source program, right? So that this is where we potentially tidy up some of our language. And let me have a look at our existing language, 3.0.
Are you sharing your screen? Because all I'm seeing is your next steps licensing and
I am so sorry. I'm an idiot. Okay.
It's late. It's late, Shane.
It is. It's 12:30 at night. Okay, so here are the open issues from yeah, here's the open issues on licensing coming up now. And these are the open issues we've got. We've got a whole bunch of different open issues. And one that I suggested we have a look at is programs, where Marcel from PwC said, why don't we dig more into program scope so that people know that their open source program is tied only to the program scope. And I'm not sure, are we looking at an issue of linguistics here and just tightening up how we refer to programs or not? So in our terms and definitions, right, we say that a program is the set of policies, processes, and personnel that comprise an organization's open source license compliance activities. And Marcel's concern is that that in itself might be too broad. And he's saying that instead of having that alone, we should add in relation to the program scope in section 1.4. Let me pull down. There we go. This section. So here we are saying that the program or the scope of this document is the key requirements for a quality open source compliance program. And if I'm right, that's what he was talking about. Let me double check there's nowhere else. Yeah. Oh, darn, I'm wrong. 3.14. Okay. My apologies, everyone. So he was saying that we should change from saying that a program is the policies, processes, and personnel that manage the organization's open source license compliance activities, and then add in relation to the program scope identified in section 3.14. And this actually very clearly says that the program can be scoped in different ways. So I think Marcel's point here is that if you just read the program definition, you might automatically assume that the OpenChain program must cover the legal entity, all of it. But later in the standard, we say you can scope a program as you want, and you need to declare the scope. I think that is a good point. And I think quite a few companies have made slight misunderstandings on their initial read in assuming that the open source compliance program must be whole entity. So Marcel's suggestion that when we refer to program in our definitions, we add in relation to the program scope, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that will get people to jump ahead and see that they can define the scope of their program as big or as small as they want. What do you think?
Well, this is Chris. I tend to agree with that because the word program capitalized like that is always subject to controversy within even corporations when you tell somebody I'm working on a program. Okay, how do you define what your program scope is?
Right.
And so I think that that's probably a good approach to trying to define what we're talking about, because it doesn't necessarily apply to the entire program. Because, for example, if you've got 3 different projects that you're working on, and we'll call them programs for sake of continuity here, one program or project could say, we're not going to use any open source. And another one may say, you can use all the open source you want as long as you follow our open source licensing and security guidelines.
Right. And we might want to say this program is scoped to a product line. So only to this product line, or more generally, it's scoped to this business unit, or scoped to this entire legal entity.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's up to the company to decide what the standard of the scope is.
Yes.
They need to define it. Yeah. They need to fill it out as in 3.1.4.
And then we ask them, write it down.
Yes.
That means that if you're one of their customer companies, you can say, so what's your program scope? And they must have that written down to explain it. So
But I'm thinking it really depends on how to say, depends on the size of the company. If the company is very big, huge, and then you use a tiny small project or program for this, it's kind of useless. I mean, useless means for this entire compliance stuff.
no, I mean, that's true. But then again, we're not trying to solve the entire company's compliance per se. We're trying to make sure that they have a conformant program. And then we're relying essentially on customer companies to say, we want stuff going through that program, not just product A, but also product B. So one good example of this, and this is where we came from originally, is that a company like Hitachi has around 1,000 legal entities. And in one legal entity, it might be involved in some of the critical systems for the Shinkansen bullet train. And some of those might be braking systems, and some of them might be, consumer level interaction systems. And it's entirely possible for the consumer level thing, they'll be saying, well, that's almost certainly containing an open source, and we want the other business unit providing that to be OpenChain conformant. But then for the, let's say, the braking system, they might be saying, well, that actually definitely isn't open source, it's bespoke. So the other business unit providing that, we don't care if they're OpenChain conformant. And that isn't Hitachi's situation. I'm just giving you an example of a giant conglomerate. But what we wanted to do was make sure that companies could slice and dice and set a program scope on the products that contained open source. But their customers could continue to ask, oh, is everything going under it? not everything. Well, we want more to go under it. Please add this product line to it. Please add this product line to it. And organically, the program will increase over time.
It's a very good. It's a very good kind of to distinguish this program conformant and license compliance. It's easily to get people confused if people don't work on this area. For me, it's quite clear, and I'm following this in our company too. Like have several different scenario, like pick some project from in-house team, pick some from supplier to make this fly, and others can copy from it or take this as a reference.
Yep. And for most companies, organizational transition, even if they wanted to go all OpenChain conformant, will take years. So for us, we're very happy. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I see. I'm too kind of how to say evaluated this task before. I thought it can be like just take months.
That's what everyone thinks. So, for us, if we get a foothold in there and someone defines a very narrowly scoped program to start, that's still a huge win because that program scope can evolve. Our main concern would be if companies looked at it and were like, I cannot do this, and walked away. That would be a failure for us. So we're opening up a starting point, and it expands after that. And our real method of expansion is procurement contracts. In other words, the customer company saying, it's wonderful you've got an OpenChain program. It's wonderful product A is going through that program, but we want product B to go through it as well, please. And then the scope expands. But yeah, I mean, I don't see any objections to Marcel's note on scoping. And indeed, that would just be a small add to our definitions section, which is, yeah, definitions. Okay, the program. So it's section 2.5 on the licensing spec. So in that case, it would be a really small add for us. And I think, if there's no objections, we just do it. Does anyone object? Nope. All right.
No, I don't object at all.
I like when we can just do something. All right. Yep. And Marcel had the wrong numbering there, 314. So I've just taken a tiny snippet of the text, and I will close this issue with that. There's so many bars on my windows, I can't see the bottom of my window anymore. Give me a second here. Okay, commit change. All right, that's done. We're closed.
Hooray.
A win. Well, it's always nice to close something. So yeah, that's great. I'm just going to link directly to the commit back in his issues. So you can see it. Done. Progress. All right, so we've closed one of the issues here. When I refresh this, it'll be gone. Yes, program is gone. We're down from 7 to 6. How about we have a quick look over at our good friends in security and see what issues they have open. Uh-oh, security has 10. Chris, it's too popular. Okay. Most of these are actually from ISO subcommittee, working group subcommittee 27, ICT security. So these are the ones marked things like ZA, NM, 05, and so on. That's the editor's contribution. All of this looks complex. Okay, let's pull up randomly one of them. Adjustment to language suggested. When we say comprised of open source software, would comprised of be better as incorporating or including? Well, that's a good question. So comprised of open source software, in the case of this commentator, is suggested as potentially sounding like it is only open source software. So it's pure open source software. And he says, he or she is saying, incorporating or including might be better because not all the supplied software might be open source. So this doc might be improved by that. What do you think? Comprised of, does it indicate only made of open source, and would incorporating open source or including open source allow people to have software that's a mixture of stuff?
Can you check the full sentence? Because I think this is just a fragment.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Can we check the full sentence in the text as this is only a fragment?
Yes. The full sentence is continuing, and it's in the chat as well. The definition of open source in this doc does merely say subject to a license. In this case, I'm going to pull open, let me pull open the security spec. In this case, the person is saying that when we define open source software in the security spec, opening 2.0, the next generation, when we define open source software, here's our definition.
Oop, there it is.
They're saying that we say subject to a license. And I'm just going to pull back to their language. They're saying they would like us to change to incorporating or including, but they think the definition of open source does merely say subject to a license. But the definition does merely say subject to a license, I believe, is a misread due to, because we're very clear. We're saying it a license that meets open source definition or free software definition or similar. So I think they had a misread on the final part of their sentence is my take. So that's why I didn't continue with their sentence, because it kind of wandered in a way where when we define open source, we're definitely saying it's open source or very close. Yeah.
Does subject to a license, and I didn't catch it when you were just flashing up there, does it say subject to an open source license?
Yes.
Because any software could have a license on it.
It must, yeah. No, that's a good point. We're saying it must be subject to one or more licenses that are open source definition.
Okay, that's good.
Software definition or similar license. And so that similar comes from our previous standards and is basically meant to include the fact that not all of the licenses have yet been approved and might be subject to contention, but would be in play in the supply chain anyway. But this commentator seems to say that read that we just meant any license, which is not true. So this brings us right back to comprised of open source software. Does it read as only consisting of open source software? And would it be better to use the term incorporating or including instead of comprised of?
Can we find where that comprised of open source software is in that document?
Absolutely, we can try.
Okay.
Comprised, there's two matches. Let me just try. Okay. Two matches. One is security assurance. It's talking about how we need to have a bill of materials, detection and resolution, and a record of identified stuff. So we're talking about what the software is comprised of. And then there's software bill of materials, saying that there should be a bill of materials for each open source software component from which the supplied software is comprised. Reading that language, it sounds like we're okay, right? Because every time we say comprised, we're defining it pretty well. Like in the case of this one, their read was comprised of open source software. But the only places it says comprised we're saying that if an open source component is in the supplied software, each open source software component from which the supplied software is comprised, there should be a record. I don't read that as suggesting the supplied software is only open source. I'm going to put this in the chat and give everyone a chance to read it in case the screen share is too small.
I concur with that, Shane. I think your analysis is right.
Ah, Andrew, hi.
I think the requester is just saying that it could be, the word comprised could be a little bit ambiguous, and that for more clarity, you would say included, use included, or what was the other word? That includes open source, to make it perfectly clear.
Yeah. That's a good read on that.
Now, Karsten flagged the README, not the document, not the standard, but there's a README which has a scope statement, which does say software solutions comprised of open source software. And let me double check, is that scope different to the scope we have on the standard?
So the word comprise
Yeah.
is to be made up of, which would mean kind of completely, but it also means to include, especially within a particular scope. So that means it's only part. So it means both the whole and the part.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I see it as being kind of ambiguous, a little bit ambiguous.
But okay, if you look at the scope definition on the top level README, I think the comment is quite right. I would rather say includes would fit there better. But it's not, the sentence is not in the spec. In the
Yep.
spec.
And there's a good point there. So Carson identified, and you'll see it in the chat, that there is a sentence which is in the README. That's not here. That's in the very top level. My apologies for goofing around. Okay, there is a sentence in the README, not the standard, which has a scope that does say comprised of open source software that could be read as saying only open source software.
Mm-hmm.
But as it happens, we killed that when we changed the entire scope sections of our document, and we focused on terms and definitions and so on. So I think we changed a lot of that.
Could we just define the word comprised to mean including or included or something, so that it's very specifically not saying that it is entirely comprised of? Because like I think it was Mary just mentioned that comprised can mean either direction.
Yep. I mean, I'm happy to clarify that.
Or just change it to included, or one of the words they suggested.
Yeah, I mean, we could change this one, for example, just putting this in the chat, original version, and
I mean, I think included is slightly better, but my concern is inconsistency between the different specifications that we have.
Right. Right.
But I don't think the ambiguity is sufficient that it's going to cause any problem in the real world. So my view is leave it as comprised. But I'm quite happy to be persuaded otherwise. I don't have a particularly strong view about this one.
just so people can see what it would look like, in the chat, you'll see the original and a potential change. And Andrew's made a very good point here, that every time we change something, we're getting a ripple effect because we're touching so many companies. So if it's a bug, definitely. If it's an ambiguity that doesn't appear to be too bad, then it's something we should hesitate before changing. But on the other hand, if you know, look at the suggested sentence. If that suggested sentence looks clean and tidy to you, a better description of what we're intending, then we can do that, and that's good if we make it better.
I think I was in this discussion before, maybe when we talk about the comprise and include, if I
Yes.
remember correctly, right?
Well, the English to that would be bad, because in the first part of the sentence, we're saying sufficiently robust to handle the identified known vulnerabilities for the open source software from which the supplied software is compromised. And which it might be better to say the open source software, which is included in the supplied software, would actually be a better way to phrase that. Because in that case, if you read it literally, it's talking about the supplied software is made up of.
Made up of. I mean, it looks like the majority view at the moment is to go with included instead of.
Yeah.
It's fine with me. I have no objection. Let's just see what the other sentence would look like. Is that it? Oh, it is. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. There we go. Software bill of materials, original sentence. And then the suggested fix is in the chat. What do you think? That's a problem. It says includes or included twice.
Yeah.
But it could be changed a bit.
Yeah, I like included there rather than tacking it on after the supplied software, where you just put it, because it's specifically talking about each open source software component that's included in the supplied software. So it's specifically talking about open source software there. Yeah. Included.
Carson suggested covers.
This was rather for the first version. So
The first version. Okay.
replace the first includes with covered what we saw software component included. I think your current version is also very right.
So okay, so
well, in your latest one, sounds like you're making a separate bill of materials for each package that is included.
each component.
Yeah. Maintaining a bill of materials
You're
for
right.
each, like
Of course.
the covers. So
Quite
creating
right.
and maintaining a bill of material that covers each open source component, because often they'll make just one software BOM, and that includes open source and proprietary, and that's really, for my opinion, that's how it should be, instead of having 27 different SBOMs floating around.
Okay, that's a very, very good point. What do you think? What do you think of this one? This one would take the phrase incorporating, and we'd use incorporated.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that's in the chat. I just posted in the chat an update. A process shall exist for creating and maintaining a bill of materials that includes each open source software component incorporated in the supplied software.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I like it.
It's quite clear.
Yep.
Good.
Okay. I mean, that sounds pretty good to me if we can use that. Nice. You know, one thing I hate about Zoom, I cannot copy paste from the meeting chat.
Yeah. I don't know why that is, because sometimes I can and sometimes I can't.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So what we have then is, unless there's a strong objection, and I take to heart very much Andrew's point that we don't want to change things unless we have to. But the consensus, not the consensus, the majority on this call appears to be that we might benefit from adjusting two sections in the language to use the phrase incorporated and includes instead of saying comprised of or is comprised. For clarity, and it seems particularly potentially useful for non-native speakers perhaps as well. In which case I'd err towards, you know, any strong objections, or do we do it? And remember, we can reverse course later if someone says that was a stupid idea. But I do want to check if anyone has any strong objections now, because we can put a pin in it and say we have to come back later. If there are no objections, we will just do it.
I think, absent any comment, that we probably could go ahead and change it. And then if somebody wants to look at it more in depth between now and the next meeting, that would be fine. And then we can reopen it if needed.
All
How
right.
about that?
Sounds good. And we haven't gone and changed any intent in play here. We've just changed how we express it, which I think might be okay. All right. I will, with great labor at 1 a.m., rewrite each of those sentences and update the standard draft with those. And with that, we're actually out of time. We've closed one issue each for compliance and security. We've covered what contribution is, and we have 2 minutes if anyone has any other business. Okay, if there's no other business at this juncture, I wanted to flag that there's a few events coming up, like the Open Compliance Summit in December, and before that in October, an OSPology live event in Germany. I will communicate those events in more detail to our mailing list, and both will provide great networking opportunities. I'm closing the meeting at this juncture, 1 minute early. Everyone, thank you for a great restart after the summer recess. We made a lot of progress, and I loved the active discussion. Have a beautiful day.
You do the same.
Thank
Have
you.
a good night.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Bye-bye now.
Bye.